Hi everyone. Today what I'm going to talk about a little bit is how to think about the next assignment, which is your compare and contrast with a poem. Now remember, for your compare and contrast paper, you can choose two poems or you can do a poem and a short story, but everything I'm going to talk about today is applicable whether you're doing a poem and a story or two poems together. So today the two poems I'm going to be looking at are The Dead by Susan Mitchell and Beyond Recall by Sharon Bryan. And I'm going to be looking at these two poems because they both have to deal with the issue of death. So the thing to remember when you're dealing with a compare and contrast paper is you have to have some point of similarity, some reason to put the two together. That can be the larger topic of the poem, as I'm doing here, or it could be a smaller feature of two very different poems. Either way, there has to be a reason why you're putting them together. So let's take a look at the two poems. So, The Dead. At night the dead come down to the river to drink. They unburden themselves of their fears, their worries for us. They take out the old photographs. They pat the lines in our hands and tell our futures, which are cracked and yellow. Some dead find their way to our houses. They go up to the attics. They read the letters they sent us, insatiable for signs of their love. They tell each other stories. They make so much noise, they wake us, as they did when we were children, and they stayed up drinking all night in the kitchen. And then we have Beyond Recall by Sharon Bryan. Nothing matters to the dead. That's what's so hard for the rest of us to take in. Their complete indifference to our enticements, our attempts to get in touch. They aren't observing us from a discreet distance. They aren't listening to a word we say. You know that, but you don't believe it. Even deep in a cave, you don't believe in total darkness. You keep waiting for your eyes to adjust and reveal your hand in front of your face. So how long a silence will it take to convince us that we're the ones who no longer exist? As far as X is concerned and Y, that they've forgotten every little thing they knew about us. What we told them and what we didn't have to, even our names mean nothing to them. Now, our throats ache with all we might have said the next time we saw them. So when you're doing a compare and contrast, you want to kind of pay attention to the two parts of a compare and contrast. Comparisons are the similarities between the two, and contrast has to do with the differences. It's not essential that you handle both similarities and differences equally in your paper. In fact, your paper should handle one more than the other. But for this assignment, the really important thing is that you're spending a lot of time on pre-writing. You can't do this paper unless you've spent some time sitting down and brainstorming all of the similarities you can think of and all of the differences you can think of. If you're going just off the top of your head with the first thing you see, you could be missing some other complexities. So just as an example, you can sit down and kind of compare the two poems. Some people will use a Venn diagram, some people will use lists. The important thing is to get it onto paper. So here you have some examples of how the poems are similar and different. The Dead is about what happens after death, and so is Beyond Recall. In the dead remember their loved ones. In Beyond Recall, they don't remember, so you have a difference. In The Dead, it's about the desires the dead feel to connect. In Beyond Recall, it's about the grief the living feels. Both poems use enjambment, and then they figure the dead in different ways. In the dead make noise and wake the living. They worry for the living. In Beyond Recall, it's the opposite. The dead are silent, so there's no communication between the living and the dead. They don't remember the living people they've left behind. The Dead uses images of loss, especially papers and photographs, like a material history. And if you think about that, a lot of times when people pass away, what we have left of them are these photographs or videos or physical reminders of who they were. Beyond Recall does not do that. In fact, it uses much more natural imagery, like the image of the cave and darkness, as a metaphor for death. In The Dead, it deals with the grief of losing a life, losing the connection to those that were loved. And Beyond Recall, it deals with the grief of losing a loved one, wanting a connection that isn't there with the dead. But for both of them, they're not negative notions of death. So in The Dead, the dead are gone, but the living no longer matter. They're beyond that. It underlies the importance of the one who remains. And beyond recall, you have this positive notion of death. The loved ones continue on, continue to love us, and makes the ones who remain important. So when you think about sitting down to organize all of this brainstorming, things to remember are this. First of all, you have to compare the same features of each poem. So if you have A, B, and C, 3 points for one poem, you can't have E, F, and G, 3 very different points for a different poem. The other thing is that the comparison has to have a main point or argument. So you can compare apples to apples or oranges to apples, but why would you do that? Because comparing apples to oranges, it's going to be different if your purpose is to make a fruit salad than it is if your purpose is to create an arrangement that you want to take a picture of. You're going to compare them for different reasons. The main point or your thesis should argue for why it's important to compare the two. So your thesis should talk about what do we achieve by the comparison? What do we get by comparing them that we wouldn't get by looking at each poem individually? So the thing that you want to ask yourself is, what do I get from comparing the two poems that I would not get from looking at the two poems individually? So one example, and I'm going to keep using The Dead and Beyond Recall, is by looking at these two poems together, we see just how important it is for the living to feel a connection to those who have passed on. Now the poems do this in really different ways, but the end result is the same. Whether we believe the dead continue on next to us or the dead have completely forgotten us, the living ache. They miss the dead. They miss that connection. And by comparing these two very different beliefs and reactions to death, you can see just how important and how devastating loss can be. So you want to build your essay and your argument around that main idea. So by looking at these two poems together, we see just how important it is for the living to feel a connection to those who have passed on. The differences between the poems show us this information. So one sees the dead as not connected, one sees the dead as connected. But what's important is they both want the connection. Whether it's there or it's not there, both poems indicate that that connection is something that's really desired by the living. So in any compare and contrast paper, you want to take that main idea and plan your organization. The heart of a compare and contrast paper is organization. There are only two ways to organize a compare and contrast. You either do it by the items being compared or by the features of those items. So you could do poem 1 and then points A, B, and C, and poem 2 points A, B, and C. And remember, the A, B, and C have to be similar or the same points for both poems. So the first method of comparison is really best for comparing two very different things because you're dealing with one whole thing and then the other whole thing. The other way to do a compare and contrast is by talking about features. So feature A of both poems, and then you talk about poem 1 and poem 2. Feature B, and you go back to poem 1, poem 2. Feature C, poem 1, poem 2. This method of organization is best for comparing two very similar things because what this is going to highlight are the specific differences. Now, if you pay attention to this little chart here, for both of these, you have to compare and contrast the same features on both sides. You have to keep things in the same order for both sides. Whatever poem you start with always has to go first. Whatever feature you start with always has to go first. And this is because compare and contrast dealing with two different objects can be very confusing. So you want to use the organization of the paper to help guide your reader. So let's take a look at an example. The Dead is about the way the dead miss us and uses the metaphor of adults downstairs waking sleeping children. This is a very comforting image. Pretty much everyone can think of a time when they were small and they heard the adults laughing in the other room and they wanted to be part of it, but they also knew they were safe because the adults were out there. It uses the imagery of old photographs, physical evidence that last past death. Beyond Recall is about the way the death don't miss us, and it uses the metaphor of the cave and darkness. Now, this is not so comforting image. We want our eyes to adjust to darkness, but in a deep, dark cave where there is no light, that's not going to happen. This underlines the point that death is unbelievable. It's a great loss. It's something that we have a hard time coming to terms with. It also uses imagery. It's using the imagery of X and Y, which immediately reminds us of math, right? We're solving for X, we're solving for Y. X and Y are also 2 points on a line. So here, X and Y are gone. The line between us is gone. This is not something emotional like a photograph, but it is something that's easily proved and scientific. It's not art the way a photograph would be or a letter would be. The other thing that you're going to want to remember, though, is despite the differences between the content and argument of these poems, both poems use enjambment, those broken lines, to show the break between living and dead. So it doesn't matter that they're about different things. They both use the same form. In the dead, you have lines like, they read the letters they sent us, insatiable for signs of their love. And that break between insatiable and for signs creates a strange kind of pause in the poem, a brokenness in the poem. And beyond recall, that's why it's so hard for the rest of us to take in. You have multiple line breaks, and in beyond recall, it's even more broken. There's spaces between those two lines. So even though the dead uses longer lines and more complete sentences, its use of enjambment creates the same effect of brokenness and disjointedness as beyond recall. So what? So remember, whenever you do a compare and contrast, you should begin and end with the point of comparison. For example, so even though the two poems see death very differently, their use of enjambment creates the same sense of a break. Whether you believe the dead continue on in a relationship with us or not, the loss of those we love creates a sense of brokenness and pain that is characteristic of loss from death. A few things to remember. It's not enough to explicate each poem, so you have to do more than tell me what each poem is saying. You have to also explain what each poem is presenting, that underlying argument it's giving us. And it's also not enough to find a list of similarities and differences. The goal of your essay, and the thing that you really have to work towards, is to explain how examining the similarities and differences side by side show us something more than the two poems alone can show, so that you're really pushing for that main argument. So that is your short kind of introduction and example to this next paper. If you have any questions, be sure to post them online or shoot me an email. And I hope that's helped.